Hello everyone, welcome to our virtual session. This class is a kind of makeup class for the session that I missed due to illness, and it's going to keep us on track to some extent. As I mentioned in class, we will push the exam forward 1 week. And when we meet again in the following week, which is let's see, the 17th, we will talk about the exam, do a review, and be prepared for the following week, which will be, I believe, the 24th. All right, so last time we talked about this style of art called Impressionism, and we presented that form of art as a convergence of a lot of different factors. Those include the Franco-Prussian War, Haussmannization, the transformations of the city of Paris that we talked about, the advent of photography, massive urbanization that's happening in the 19th century. All these things are sort of baked into the style of Impressionism. So now I want to talk to you today a little bit about what follows from that movement. And I apologize, my voice is a little rough today. I'm having some allergy issues. So I might pause here and there to have a drink of this coffee here. So just as critics were beginning to accept Impressionism as a style, it had to be abandoned. And we've talked a lot about this idea of modernism in our class, that as soon as an artistic style is conventionalized, as soon as it's normalized and accepted, it has to be abandoned according to modernism, because modern art must maintain kind of antagonistic relation to the dominant culture. It must be outside the dominant culture. And so it makes sense that when we look at this early history of modernism, what we see is a rapid succession of movements as each style gains some prominence and then is subsequently abandoned, according to this logic of the avant-garde, in which art is operating outside and ahead of the dominant culture. There's a quote I think is revealing in these terms, and it's by a very famous artist, French artist named Renoir. He says, "I had wrung Impressionism dry, and I finally came to the conclusion that I knew neither how to paint or to draw. In a word, Impressionism was a blind alley as far as I was concerned." So this quote is interesting. Not only does it give us a sense of the abandonment of Impressionism and that modernist drive toward the new, but it also gives you a hint of what was to follow that style of Impressionism. Now, one of the difficult things of defining Post-Impressionism is that it's such a varied mix. As the name suggests, the name just really tells us this is work that occurs after Impressionism. It doesn't really tell us much about what it looks like. But one of the dominant strands of this genre is work that takes on a more systematic examination of the properties of line, pattern, form, and color. Work that is often interested in structural elements of art and can be quite technical. We're going to see several examples where that is the case. Now, that's one strand of this. On the other side of the spectrum, operating within the same movement, we have an artist like Van Gogh, and obviously that doesn't necessarily apply to his work, as we've talked about here and there, and we'll go into more detail. But what's important to point out here is this exhaustion with Impressionism and this need for a new style, which leads some artists towards a more structural investigation of art, others towards a more expressionist style. So, one of the cultural historical influences that comes on the stage at this moment is an obsession on the part of Western Europe, especially France, with all things Japanese. Now, you might have learned in your Western Civ classes that Japan maintained a largely isolationist agenda for most of its history, at least for long stretches of its history during the Meiji period and other periods. All of this ends rather abruptly in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry, a U.S. naval commander, shows up at the shores of Japan and almost forces the country to trade with the United States. And this is the beginning, a kind of opening of the floodgates for trade. And what happens as a result of that is Japanese kimonos, fans, lacquer cabinets, tea caddies, folding screens, tea services, jewelry began to flood into places like Paris. And artists take note of this, as we saw with photography, where the new technology kind of bled into the style of painting. Well, the same thing happens with Japan, or with Japanese-mei, which is a term that refers to this fascination with all things Japanese that happens at the end of the 19th century. So, for artists, one of the most important influences are these Japanese prints, and they're called ukiyo-e, which refers to an art of the floating world, is sort of the literal translation. And what's meant by that is these Japanese prints, they tend to chronicle everyday scenes, seemingly insignificant events, occurrences that happen that don't really seem to be extraordinary in any way. They're about the sort of repetitiveness of the everyday. And Western artists borrow, maybe steal, in the case of Van Gogh, quite a bit of the formal vocabulary of these Japanese prints. So what I mean when I say formal vocabulary is the stylistic attributes of form, so color, texture, shape, space, things of that nature. And you can see here, looking at these two paintings, one by James Whistler of the Battersea Bridge in England, and then Hiroshige, who is undoubtedly the most famous of these ukiyo-e printmakers. You might be familiar with his print called The Wave, often reproduced, very famous work. What you can see is when you look at these two works, Whistler is reproducing Hiroshige's style, even though he's painting a Western subject. He's made it look very Japanese. And there are three formal elements that we can say Whistler has borrowed from ukiyo-e, and we can say that a lot of post-impressionist artists in general have borrowed from this Japanese influence. And those are a kind of spatial flattening, right? The Japanese prints look and feel kind of two-dimensional almost, relative to what the Western audience expects with deep perspectival space of, say, Renaissance paintings. Here the image looks kind of flat and two-dimensional, almost like cardboard cutouts. What they also take is an interest in asymmetrical compositions. So a symmetrical composition, as you might guess, is one in which all the elements are balanced, and if we were to fold that painting in half, it would pretty much match up on each side, right? The Japanese have a very concerted focus on asymmetrical composition, and it gives it the sense of movement and whimsy and this free-flowing quality that Western artists gravitate towards, and you see them reproducing that. So with Whistler's painting on the right, you can see that the column of the bridge is slightly off-centered. It gives it this kind of whimsical feeling, right? It's an asymmetrical composition. And the last element is a monochromatic palette. So what we mean by that is the palette is severely reduced, and sometimes reduced almost to a single color that the artist used multiple shades of, right? You can kind of see this in Hiroshige. Maybe it's not the best print to use this as an example, but the Japanese ukiyo-e printmakers really do like this very restrained minimalist color palette where they're using just a few colors. So those three things are places where we see the influence of Japanese art on Western artists. Here's another example here, Degas. We talked about him last time. We can look at Kiyonaga's Woman's Bath, and we know that Degas looked at this very immediately before painting the tub painting on the left, and you can see that he's playing with perspective here. Look at the way the top of that table looks relative to the body. It doesn't really match up, and this is something, a liberty that Japanese artists often take to show important attributes of the story. So we see the subject from an aerial view at the same time. We see them as kind of a profile view. Now, according to the conventions of Western art, that's not realistic, and that's not the way traditionally or historically artists in the West have painted, but Degas and others began to play with this largely because of the influence of Japanese art. And we can see Vincent van Gogh here, a huge fan of all things Japanese, in particular ukiyo-e prints, and we can see in his self-portrait on the wall behind him a very recognizable image, and we can see Mount Fuji in the back of that Japanese print. And in fact, Van Gogh copied as best as he could Hiroshige prints as a way to learn the style. And it's not coincidental that in his paintings afterwards, a lot of those qualities we talked about appear, that asymmetrical composition, monochromatic palette, and a spatial flattening. Okay, so let's talk now about one of the most important artists of the post-impressionist period, and that is Cézanne. This is his Bay of Marseilles from 1886, and immediately what we said at the beginning of the lecture with Renoir's quote seems to apply here. Cézanne is very interested in structure, form. His works are meticulous, they're painstakingly precise. Unlike the Impressionist painters, his work takes quite a long time to produce. And he's very interested in the kind of solidity of forms. Look at those buildings, look at the geometry of the landscape. Look at what's happening with the space of this painting. A lot of strange things. It's almost as if those mountains in the background are coming towards us. The water that seems to be behind the built environment sits on top of the painting in a strange way. It's these spatial ambiguities that Cézanne is sort of known for. Very famous quote by Cézanne kind of reinforces our initial impressions of the work. He says, "Treat nature by the cylinder, the sphere, the cone, everything in proper perspective so that each side of an object or a plane is directed toward a central point. Lines parallel to the horizon, that is a section of nature. Give breadth. Lines perpendicular to the horizon give depth, but nature for us men is more depth than surface." So just in the language of the way he talks about his paintings, you really get a kind of engineer's perspective here. Everything is about volume, three-dimensionality, form, this methodical investigation, really different from the Impressionist work, which was created very quickly in order to capture that speed of modernization that we saw in 19th century Paris. This is a work painted from his bedroom of his house that was used as a kind of retreat, and you can see again the interplay of foreground, background, middle ground. The mountain is framed by the trees. We call this a framing device, and that tends to push the mountain back, and yet the cool colors push it forward. It's hard to situate ourselves within this space. This is really laying the groundwork for something we'll see in the near future called Cubism, where these incompatible vantage points are really explicit in the canvas, but they're here in kind of embryonic form in the work of Cezanne, and Picasso will draw very directly from Cezanne in those works. This is a work that's in the MoMA in New York. It's an incredible painting to see in person if you get a chance. You can see that the Kiyonaga print that we discussed at the beginning, and the way in which perspectives are becoming disjointed. We see the apples from profile, we see the biscuits in the top right from an elevated view. If you follow that back line of the table across the canvas, you'll see it sinks on the left-hand side. That doesn't make sense. You can see the bottle itself, a line kind of coming off of the bottle. This is a scene that's kind of pulling itself apart. And yes, it's a very traditional subject, but formally what he's doing is very radical and new. And again, the style of working here represents a pretty drastic departure from Impressionism. Cezanne had to replace these apples several times because they kept rotting, because he took so long to do the painting. It's an explicit rejection of that style of speed and instantaneity that we saw with Impressionism. Okay, another painter that I would put into this cerebral camp of Post-Impressionism is Georges Seurat. Seurat is a fascinating figure, an artist whose work is so instantly recognizable because of the style he develops called pointillism. And here it is in its early stages here. Seurat loved to paint everyday life, everyday Parisian life, but he was heavily influenced by advancements happening in industry, in particular color theory. He looked to people like Charles Blanc, who was developing printing techniques around color. And in that investigation of printing, he realized that the smaller the area of colors that are juxtaposed against one another, the greater the tendency of the eye to mix these colors. This is the basis for the Bende dot system, which is how most cartoons are printed in the 20th century. Maybe you've seen the red, green, and blue dots. And when they get closer together, it feels like the color becomes darker, even though the dots are the same color. When they are further apart, it feels like they become lighter. And of course, when you put different dots next to one another, you can make a third color because the eye blends them. There's also another figure named Michel Chevreul, who was a chemist working in the textile industry. And Chevreul observed that when we place two colors next to one another, it changes our perception of each. So if I put a green dot next to a blue dot, that green dot now appears to have a new hue to it, because the eye is constantly mixing colors. So these basic observations that are happening in the textile industry and other venues become the basis for Seurat's painting, and undoubtedly the most famous of these works is A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of the Grand Jatte. This is a work in Chicago. It's a large piece. I guess you could say it's sort of life-size because the figures would be, between 5 and 6 feet in person. So first of all, the subject matter, before we get to the unique form of the work. Seurat is painting a relatively new phenomenon, and that is middle-class, even working-class leisure. Remember that it's only in the late 19th century that a worker at a factory would have a day off. That was sort of unheard of in the earlier portions of the century, and there's this whole cultural initiative to define working class leisure. What do you do? What do you do on your day off? Of course, the landed gentry and aristocrats had very formalized hobbies and sports, and hunting and all kinds of things. That we saw the flaneur wandering the streets, but there weren't those established conventions for working class people with a day off. And the city of Paris begins to create these large open spaces for this new activity, and this is one of those spaces. So what we're looking at here is this relatively modern phenomenon. And it's clear that Seurat has referenced all of the different class distinctions in the painting. If we look in the left-hand corner here, we can see a member of the proletariat lounging on his elbows, a working class fellow. Behind him appears to be more of an upper class figure, all cohabiting this space, around leisure. Now, the style for Seurat was not just technical or scientific, it also had certain political implications, because if you approach this painting and you get close to the surface, what you'll see are a series of tiny dots, and you can hopefully sense that in the trees there in this image. But it doesn't duplicate the experience of seeing it up close, because as you approach the canvas, the image sort of disintegrates and all you see is dots. And you have to move away from the canvas for those dots to then congeal into recognizable forms, because what's happening is the eye is blending those dots into solid masses. Those solid forms are not actually there on the canvas. It's a brilliant, interesting way of approaching the medium. For Seurat, this was a democratic form of painting, because it no longer was it a matter of an artist distributing his or her master vision to an audience, right? The artist just put the raw materials on the canvas, and it was the audience that then assembled these dots into an image. The audience was the active member in this equation. So you'll recall with Courbet, we talked about ways in which the style of the work was democratic in nature and political. And here we have another approach to painting that has political implications just in the way that the paint is applied to the canvas, notwithstanding the content or the scene, even though there is a message in the content. If you'll notice the figure on the right with the dress and umbrella, many people have noted that the little monkey in front of her, there's a visual rhyme there, right, where that form is repeated in the bodice of her dress and the back of the monkey. It's hard not to read that as an evolutionary diagram. The ideas of Charles Darwin, of course, are circulating and are part of the public discourse, and it feels like what he's saying here is this modern leisure society is the next step in an evolutionary progress of the human species. So let's talk about Van Gogh, and hopefully you can see here that it's an odd pairing to go from Seurat to Van Gogh, isn't it? It feels like two very different artists. Van Gogh's work, of course, being much more rooted in emotion and feeling relative to Seurat and Cézanne, who are comparatively cerebral and analytical kinds of painters. And that's kind of the trick of Post-Impressionism, that it's a grab bag in many ways of a lot of different styles. So Van Gogh was the son of a Protestant pastor and believed early on in his life that he too would become a pastor, and he had a religious calling. He did missionary work in the slums of London, and then he went to the mining districts of Belgium, and that's where he saw the subjects in this painting. And then after a series of failures, he fell into a lifelong despair. And to make matters worse, he suffered from epileptic seizures. Essentially, he departs into nature, retreats into nature, has very minimal social contact. His primary social contact is with his brother Theo Van Gogh. And his letters have been anthologized to his brother, and they're just beautiful. If you get a chance, read some of these letters, the bond between these two people is just a really wonderful, beautiful thing. And his brother was constantly helping him out, sending him money, checking in on him, worrying about him constantly, and so on. So in one of those letters, Van Gogh nicely summarizes what his painting is about. He says, "Instead of trying to reproduce exactly what I have before my eyes, I use color more arbitrarily so as to express myself forcibly." And he described his color as, quote, "not locally true from the point of view of the delusive realist, but color suggesting some emotion of an ardent temperament." So you can see here that Van Gogh is basically admitting to his brother that his desire for creating this work is not to faithfully reproduce reality, but to use reality to convey some emotion. And here, the potato eaters, Van Gogh is always drawn to the kind of downtrodden of society. You can see the monochromatic palette we talked about earlier. It's all shades of brown, essentially. And the way that he paints these figures, he's almost made them into caricatures, where the distortions of the face almost look like they're no longer human, right? And we see this very humble living situation, and Van Gogh takes us underground, and we almost feel as though we're in the mines with these workers, even though we're sitting down for dinner with them. So he described this work in the following terms. He says, "You see, I really have wanted to make it so that people get the idea that these folk who are eating their potatoes by the light of their little lamp have tilled the earth themselves with these hands they are putting in the dish. And so it speaks of manual labor, and that they have thus honestly earned their food. I wanted to give it the idea of a wholly different way of life from ours, civilized people. So I certainly don't want everyone just to admire it or approve of it without knowing why." So there's a kind of authenticity here, right? And Van Gogh, being a missionary, had lived in these circumstances and saw that as the basis for being able to paint the subject in this way. So here you can see the kind of later style of Van Gogh, the kind of work you're probably more familiar with. This is the Night Cafe. This is when Van Gogh moves to southern France, to a city called Arles, about a year and a half before his eventual suicide. And if I ask you what kind of place this is, you'd probably say it's a lonely place. It feels like it's late at night. We look at these patrons in this cafe, and they're kind of huddled around their drinks, right? And it feels as though we've just walked into this space, and the proprietor there in the white coat is addressing us, asking us what we'd like to have. It's quiet, it's desolate, it's empty, and look at the colors. It's kind of sickly yellow color. It's kind of an anxiety-producing colors. Then we look at the angles of the floor, and there's a very steep angle to the floor. We almost expect that pool table to come sliding off. It's not a hospitable place. So again, is Van Gogh trying to faithfully reproduce a late 19th century cafe in Arles? No, not primarily, right? He's trying to reproduce the emotional, psychological experience of this one person, Van Gogh himself, at this moment in time. And that's what gives him the liberty to depart from realism. Do those lights really have those strange halos surrounding them? Is the whole scene sort of bathed in this sickly yellow color? No, probably not. But that's the medium by which Van Gogh expresses this psychological state, and that state is one of anxiety, depression, and desperation. Van Gogh, the bedroom at Arles. This is a really somber, sad piece, and it's funny to say that because it's an empty room, right? And one would think that an empty room would not have any sort of narrative behind it, but it's clear that Van Gogh is painting something pretty specific here. On the right-hand wall there, you'll see two portraits. One is Van Gogh, the other is Gauguin. Gauguin was a very well-known painter. He came to stay with Van Gogh, and the two of them dreamed about opening an artist colony. That dream fell apart, and Gauguin left. He traveled to Polynesia and went around the world making paintings that he's very famous for. Van Gogh was heartbroken when the idea of the artist colony collapsed, and he had a great personal attachment to Gauguin. And this is when he tries to cut off his ear, has a serious breakdown. It's when Gauguin leaves. And with all that in mind, the room is kind of a testament to this loneliness. You see the portraits of the pair on the right. You see the bed with two pillows. You see the room with two chairs. And the room is ominously empty, right? It's about the collapse of this dream and the collapse of his relationship with Gauguin. And again, the irregular angles of everything in this space kind of reinforce the depression that Van Gogh is feeling. And then, of course, the Starry Night. This is when Van Gogh was institutionalized and looked out the window of his asylum at Saint-Remy and saw the sky. And the sky becomes a kind of canvas for all the inner turmoil that Van Gogh was feeling, right? Everything is in motion in this painting. Even the cypress trees are moving at the hands of some invisible force, almost as if they are flames. So on the one hand, it's a depressing painting, but the cypress tree is a symbol of death and eternal life. The brightest star in the sky is Venus, which is the symbol of love. And in a letter to his brother, he talks about looking at this scene, and it gives us a glimpse into his motivation behind the painting. He says, "Perhaps death is not the hardest thing in a painter's life. Look at the stars. Looking at the stars always makes me dream, as I dream over the black dots representing towns and villages on a map. Why, I ask myself, shouldn't the shining dots of the sky be as accessible as the black dots on a map of France? Just as we take the train to Raoul or Arles, we take death to reach a star." And this is his last painting. There's some debate about the story behind it. Some say that it was in the actual field where he shot himself. Others say that's not the case, but it's certainly the last painting, and his suicide seems to be written into the work in a really direct, disturbing way. So Wheatfield with Crows, you can see the aggressive brushstrokes. Look at the way those shards of wheat are painted. One quick stabbing line for each of them. There's almost a violence to the way the paint is applied to the canvas. We have these two roads disappearing into the wheat field. And instead of a road going to the horizon and taking the eye into the future in that typical traditional way, this road ends abruptly. It's hard not to see that as a metaphor for what's about to happen. And of course we have these crows circling overhead almost like vultures waiting for a body. So again, if I were to describe to you what this painting is about, the content of the image is not nearly as important as the way that it's painted, right? And the style of expressionism, if you look at the sky there, that frantic feeling of slapping this paint on the canvas, that's really the gist of this work, and the way that it can communicate this horrific mental state without literally showing anything along those lines. Okay, Toulouse-Lautrec was a member of the upper classes. He had a physical deformity that prevented his full entry into that aristocratic circle. He was a very short man. I think he was under 5 feet. You can see him in this painting. In the middle of the painting, he's right in front of a tall man. You can see his face there in his against the coat of that man. And he is obsessed with the underbelly of Paris. He likes to go to places like the Moulin Rouge, which was a kind of cabaret bar, open all night. At 2, 3, 4 in the morning, it was a mainstay for artists and poets, and this is the life that Toulouse-Lautrec is interested in. You can see he's very expressionistic in the way that he paints. If we look at the face of the female figure on the right, she is almost soaked in absinthe. She has that odd bluish cast. We look at the top of the table in the left-hand bottom corner there. Again, thinking of the Japanese woodcuts, it's almost like we're looking at that from an elevated view, and yet we look at the scene from a profile view, these interrupted spaces, showing Toulouse-Lautrec's interest in Japanese art. And he also did a number of promotional images for the Moulin Rouge. This one is probably the most famous. It features the most well-known dancer at the time, Jane Avril, who most people had some sort of infatuation with, Toulouse-Lautrec being one of those many people. And what he's done here is really a wonderful image, right? It's a lithograph to be mass-produced as a kind of advertisement. But you can see the headstock of the bass there mimics the hair of the bass player. And the bass then wraps around the frame, almost as if attaching to her body. And we feel as though she is sort of a puppet of this music. It's one of those instances where the artist is trying to represent sound in a visual means. And it introduces all these interesting aesthetic questions, because sound often achieves a physical presence in our lives. When you go to the club and you feel sound hitting your chest, or you pull up next to a car at a stoplight and you can hear the bass rattling the bumper or whatever. Sound can take on physical presences, and that's what he's trying to paint through the body of Jane Avril. Okay, so that's a quick run-through of Post-Impressionism. Just to recap a bit, the main influences here, of course, are Japan, the spatial flattening, asymmetrical compositions, monochromatic palette, also a desire to reject Impressionism, which takes many artists towards the opposite extreme of very structural, formal, geometric paintings in some cases. That would be Cézanne, that would be Seurat. In other cases, like Van Gogh, we have the arrival of Expressionism, which is a style of painting in which you try to externalize an interior state, an interior psychological state. So all this is laying the groundwork for, as I mentioned earlier, some of the 20th century movements which you may be somewhat familiar with, like Cubism, pop art, abstract expressionism. They're all kind of here in their early form. And when we get to those movements in the next few weeks, you'll be able to draw correlations to this earlier work. Okay, so I will see everyone next week when we will be talking about, I believe it's German Expressionism. I'm not sure. I'll have to check my syllabus on that. And I look forward to seeing you then. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Okay? Take care.